Welcome to the Marine Biologist podcast. Join us to discover the latest topics by leading marine researchers and conservationists. The podcast accompanies The Marine Biologist, the magazine for members of the Marine Biological Association, as presented by the editor, Guy Baker.
In this episode, we're delighted to welcome Callum Roberts, Professor of Marine Conservation in the Centre for Ecology and Conservation at the University of Exeter. Hi, Callum.
Hi.
We're going to be talking about marine protected areas. I've got a few questions, and the first one was to do with setting the scene. Marine protected areas can be many different things. Can you give us an overview?
Yes, a marine protected area is just an area of sea that is managed differently to other areas of ocean to afford some degree of protection to something within nature, obviously, a habitat or a species that lies within that area. So they are highly variable in nature. You might have a protected area that is established just to protect porpoises, for example, or you might have a protected area that is designed to protect all of nature, and collectively all of that space is protected from extractive or other damaging and harmful uses.
There's a lot in the scientific literature about marine protected areas and about their effectiveness. A recent study of the largest marine protected areas suggested that only a third are capable of offering real protection on a global scale. What are the challenges in effective protection in these large remote areas?
That study looked at effective protection from the point of view of the level of protection that was given to an area. So what it said was it used the MPA guides framework for assessing protected areas, and that assigns a protected area a level of protection based on the rules and regulations present, from minimally protected through lightly protected to highly and fully protected. And so this study that you mentioned was essentially saying that only those protected areas that are highly and fully protected from exploitation, harm, and damage are capable of recovering nature. And that's because, nature, it doesn't care if you designate a protected area and just call it protected and offer no real protection in the water. What matters is whether or not animals stop being killed, habitats stop being disrupted or destroyed. So the level of protection given really matters. And the problem is that very little of the ocean at the moment is highly or fully protected. If you look across European seas, the fraction of the sea that is protected to this level is below 1% in all of the European nations, including the UK. And it's the average across Europe is 0.2%. So 2/100 of the sea is actually given the level of protection which is sufficient for nature to make a comeback.
And when we're talking about marine protected areas in the public realm, do you think we should be quoting these very low figures for what is actually protected?
Well, I do, because I think it's a kind of reality check on what we are doing to address biodiversity loss, overfishing, destructive fishing, and all these kinds of impacts that go on in the sea. I think up to now there's been quite a lot of magical thinking going on in the realms of power and those who designate protected areas, and that comes down to politicians being reluctant to upset any particular constituency. They're confronted by people from the conservation side who really want to see nature protected and industrial fishing controlled much more highly. And then on the other side, they're faced with the fishing lobby who want to carry on doing things in much the same way as they've been doing for decades to hundreds of years. And so ministers have solved this in a very yes minister type way by establishing protected areas but allowing people to carry on fishing in them. Unfortunately, that will make no difference at all to nature. It just means that there's a line on a map and a tick that can be made against a target of establishing protected areas and expanding them across the sea, but it doesn't make any meaningful difference to nature. If we want to protect nature in the sea, then we need to offer it a much higher level of protection from extractive uses or other damaging activities.
Yes, thank you. I suspect I know the answer to this question already, but there's a debate over protecting features within an MPA versus protecting the whole site. Which approach do you favour and why?
Well, this was one of the perverse outcomes of the Marine Conservation Network expansion in about 2010. So when the government was busy trying to deliver on the Marine and Coastal Access Act, which is supposed to turn around the state of UK seas from a really low point that there was up to the agreement of that law, they established these protected areas, and then, of course, they assessed the protected areas as to what really needs protection, as if we can sort of decide, oh, this bit's vulnerable, that bit isn't, and therefore, if we can get away with the minimum necessary to protect, then few people will be inconvenienced by this marine protected area. But the reality is that this was a nonsense, and by looking at features one at a time, let's say an oyster bed here, or a horse mussel bed, or a kelp forest, or whatever, and thinking, does this need protection from damaging uses? And a panel of earnest scientists got together to figure out, what was resilient, what was not resilient, and the net result was a network that protected almost nothing. 90% of the conservation objectives for this new network of marine protected areas was to maintain them as they were. And, how on earth do we get into this state? The Marine and Coastal Access Act is supposed to make a network of protected areas to revive the state of English seas, but instead mandates that those areas stay the same. Well, what went wrong is that in judging what nature needs from protection, we badly misread it. The seas around the UK have been impacted by industrial fishing and many other sorts of activities for a long time, 200 years at least. And those areas are already heavily altered by those activities, and especially by bottom trawling and dredging, which in their initial phases, in the early 19th century, swept away biogenic habitats that covered tens of thousands of square kilometers of the sea around the UK. Those habitats no longer exist. We're faced with shifting sands and gravels that are dominated by mud-dwelling worms and crabs and mollusks. And so when we look at them today and say, can these areas withstand being knocked on the head every couple of years by a bottom trawl, the answer is obviously yes, because they are the only things that are there because they are knocked on the head by bottom trawls. If you were not to trawl that area, you would get a different community coming back. And that's the whole point of marine protection. Nature protection is about permitting recovery, but the UK's Marine Protected Area Network has not permitted recovery and is fundamentally incapable of doing so until we actually reverse that metric. Instead of saying, what protection does the stuff that's there now need, we need to think about what is this piece of sea capable of if we were to protect it from extractive and damaging uses. And by creating a marine protected area network like that, then we will see recovery take place. Then we will see the transformation of the fortune of European seas.
It reminds me of the case on land of upland areas that are being managed to protect skylarks, and that the ambition of protection is just for a very limited number of species that happen to survive in a very degraded environment.
That's definitely the case. And unfortunately, by applying those kind of nature gardening approaches in the sea, we have ultimately completely failed to make any difference for the marine environment at all. We really need to think about how is nature developing and adapting and capable of producing something which is vibrant, thriving, productive, and of greater value than the kind of degraded areas that exist over much of the sea today.
it's the case that almost no one can visualize what the seabed used to look like or is capable of looking like.
That's right. Well, a colleague of mine, Ruth Thurston, she, together with a large group of people across Europe, reconstructed the history of oyster reefs. What they found was that going back in time, there were few descriptions of extensive oyster reefs until you were in materials that were over 100 years old. And even those materials represented a shifted baseline. They were talking about oysters as being scattered over the seabed. Go back a further 100 years, and then you start seeing descriptions of oyster reefs as these three-dimensional structures, really dense aggregations of animals supporting a very wide diversity of life. That shift in the nature of the seabed happened a very long time ago, way before human memory. What's interesting about oysters and what they revealed to us about the past state of the seabed is that people were really interested in them. And so there are lots of descriptions of oysters and oyster fisheries and oyster scarcity and collapse in the newspapers of the day. So we can go back through those historic archives and find out from the concerns that people expressed that we were losing those ecosystems well over 100 years ago.
It's a global commitment to effectively conserve and manage 30% of our seas by 2030. And fishermen are concerned about spatial squeeze when exclusion from marine protected areas is combined with offshore wind and other sea uses. Are MPAs located in the best fishing grounds?
Well, it's certainly the case that areas of high importance for nature might also be areas that are particularly attractive to the fishing industry. The fishing industry has been particularly good over time at finding concentrations of marine life. And so it's not surprising that there is spatial competition for access to those places and to protect them. But ultimately, when we create marine protected areas, we're establishing protected sources for replenishment of populations, which will happen at much larger scales and which will sort of flood from protected areas into fishing grounds. So looking at a protected area, if you were to shut off a protected area completely to all extractive use, so no fishing is allowed in that protected area, then what goes on is that the animals inside become more abundant, they become bigger, they become more reproductively active, and most of them have a dispersal stage as an egg or a larvae, which is in the plankton. So those can drift over long distances and will mean that the protected area population can replenish populations in the fishing grounds. The other thing is that animals in those protected areas will experience more crowded conditions, more competition, and so they will start moving out into the surrounding areas. And both of these mechanisms have been very thoroughly demonstrated by science now. And so we see how establishing a network of protected areas doesn't mean that the fishing industry is experiencing just costs. There are also significant gains to be had from that. And in many parts of the world, protected areas are supporting healthy and productive fisheries.
And scientific knowledge of what habitats are where on the seabed, even around the well-studied waters of the UK, is still patchy. Can we harness knowledge amongst fishers of the seabed for better outcomes for fishers and conservation?
We could, if they were to share it with us. The problem fundamentally is that within the industry, if there's distrust and concern over the intentions of conservationists, it makes it difficult to have a sort of free flow of information from one group to the other. If fishers are concerned about being shut out of their most productive areas and that those might also be highly suitable for nature conservation purposes, then they're probably not going to let on to the conservationists where those are. I think one of the criticisms of marine protected area establishment that has currency is that protected areas established by consensus across industry and conservation often are in places that are relatively poor for the purposes of either. So, they're places that are not fished very much because there's not very much there. And because there's not very much there, their conservation value is more limited. And so these are sort of referred to as residual MPAs. They're not addressing the challenges that we have. They're not turning around the condition of intensely used areas of sea in the way that we need to if we're going to give fisheries a future and nature a future. I think a lot of the surveillance and monitoring of small-scale coastal MPAs is done, from near shore. So if you go to the Isle of Arran in Scotland, for example, there isn't a patrol boat out there all the time checking out whether anyone is in the MPA doing things that they shouldn't be. There is a whole group of concerned citizens who live on the island who are looking out of their windows at the sea, and they can see if somebody's in the wrong place and doing the wrong thing, and that then gets reported to the authorities. So essentially, your compliance for small-scale coastal protected areas in relatively intensively used areas is dependent on local scrutiny and surveillance. If you establish, though, some enormous marine protected area in somewhere like the middle of the Pacific Ocean, then you have to use entirely different approaches to monitor. And the key here is to observe those areas from space. And there have been rapid advances in the technology and capacity to monitor activities on the sea in those areas. Initially, you could track the movements of vessels at sea using the satellite pingers that they carry. It's called an automatic identification system, and it's used in maritime safety. And that beams up the position of the boat to a satellite. Other boats can see where it is. The coastal authorities can see where the boat is. They can go to the rescue if they get into trouble. But actually, quite a lot of boats don't want to be seen out there on the open ocean. And the reason is that they're undertaking clandestine activities. They might be illegally fishing. They might be violating the conditions of a protected area. But now we can see those boats too by using synthetic aperture radar mounted into satellites. So that dark fleet can also be detected. Of course, figuring out the identity of the boats and then tracking them back to the ports is a new challenge. Once we can see the vessels, then we have to find out ways that we can bring them to justice if they are seen to be violating the regulations of a protected area. But it's becoming much, much harder to hide in these kinds of large-scale protected areas.
There's a lot of controversy on trawling in marine protected areas. Can we have your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so should trawling happen in marine protected areas? Absolutely not. Trawling is an industrial activity. It's highly destructive of seabed life. It alters habitats. It has compromised the existence of really biodiverse and productive habitats that are built by marine organisms like mollusks, for example, or worms. And so it's utterly incompatible with nature conservation. And we can't continue to call an area a protected area and be taken seriously if it is open to industrial extraction using trawls and dredges, because there is that fundamental incompatibility. It's like going in and clear felling an area of wildwood that is a protected area. There's no essential difference there. So we either get rid of trawling and dredging from protected areas, or we take them off the statute books. There isn't a middle way here. Protected areas that aren't protected from trawling and dredging are not delivering nature protection. So get rid of them or give them the protection they need. And I think the Attenborough Ocean film made that very clear. And in fact, it would have been far more dramatic and disturbing for audiences if the trawls had been dragged across areas of seabed that had not already been trawled several times, probably in the last couple of years. So, what we saw were the trawls operating in areas that were already degraded by the passage of trawls. And just imagine the carnage if you were to see the first passes of a trawl in some pristine ecosystem.
And what are your hopes for marine protected areas in the high seas, those areas beyond national jurisdiction?
Well, the world has committed to establish protected areas across 30% of land and sea by 2030. That's a bold ambition. And if you look at protected areas across the ocean as a whole, about 9% of the ocean is protected right now. But if you look at the distribution of that protection, 22.5% of national waters are protected right now. So we're actually, reasonably well on course for protecting 30% of those waters by 2030. But in the high seas, those international waters, only 1.45% has been protected. So we're way behind the curve there. And the reason is that there has been, until now, no agreed mechanism to establish marine protected areas. There are a few that exist in Antarctica, for example, established under the Antarctic Treaty. There are a few in the North Atlantic established under a regional program of OSPAR, but essentially there is no sort of universally agreed formula for creating protected areas until the High Seas Treaty comes along. So it's probable that in the next 12 months or so that the treaty mechanism will begin to be established, and then we will have the ability to create protected areas on the high seas. But getting to 30% of the ocean protected by 2030 is absolutely impossible without the high seas being included. And so we urgently need to ramp up activities here, and those high seas protected areas also need the same high and full levels of protection as those in coastal waters. So we need to figure out mechanisms of monitoring them and enforcing them, and those are still unclear. If you think about the scale of the challenge for marine protected areas establishment on the high seas, then protecting 30% of the high seas means protecting a space that is double the size of all protected areas in the ocean and triple the size of all protected areas on land. So we are, we're looking at creating more protected areas than the world has protected to date anywhere, just in the high seas alone. So it's an enormous challenge. I think realistically, it won't happen by 2030, but it's going to become, the singular dominating feature of ocean conservation for at least a decade to come, and it will be an enormous opportunity for those who get involved. I think having the global community come together in a cooperative, collaborative way to create that network will in itself be a challenge. We're confronted in Antarctica, for example, with a breakdown in consensus among the nations that are parties to that treaty, which has blocked further protected area establishment for many years, and that deadlock has yet to be broken. So making the High Seas Treaty work will be an enormous challenge in itself, let alone establishing the first protected areas and getting to 30%.
And so what would some of your priorities be if you could be in charge of that process for high seas protection?
Well, I think I would establish as a matter of great urgency the committees who are going to scrutinize and decide upon MPA proposals. And I would also try and facilitate environmental organizations and governments around the world to cooperate to put together proposals as fast as possible. I would also want to have built within the High Seas Treaty a capability, a scientific and analytical capability, which would enable it to understand how those each of those protected areas that are being proposed fits together as a whole, so that the network is more than just the sum of its parts. I think the other thing, and we haven't really talked about this, but it certainly comes up in the context of bottom trawling within MPAs or even outside of them, and that is that over the years society has realized that some of the things that we do to the ocean are destructive not only of the provision of food, overfishing, for example, but also destructive of things that are important to us. And one of those is the global life support system, and that is dependent upon careful climate regulation by nature. And in the sea, we know that there are huge amounts of carbon, organic carbon, that is stored in ocean sediments. And those ocean sediments, when they get stirred up by bottom trawling and dredging or other kinds of industrial activities at sea, port and harbour dredging, aggregate extraction, cabling for wind farms, pipe laying for oil and gas platforms, all of that disturbance is liberating that stored carbon, and that can potentially get back into the atmosphere and accelerate the rate of climate change. So we now have different priorities. We're beginning to realize that doing things the way we do may not be sensible because we need to protect the climate system. And so a project that I've been leading for a number of years now is the Convex Seascape Survey, and we're on an urgent mission to find out just how much carbon is being released from disturbed seabed sediments and how that disturbance is distributed across different industries. It's not just fishing that's causing it, the disturbance. How bad is our port and harbour dredging, for example, by comparison? Should we be doing things differently there? So I think we need to protect our seas to a much greater extent for a whole range of different reasons than the sort of arguments about nature. It's about nature and the services that it provides to us, and those services include keeping the planet healthy and habitable.
Yeah, and I guess those industries include deep sea mining.
I have looked into deep sea mining in some detail with colleagues, and we've concluded that it's unnecessary in the first place because there are sufficient proven reserves of all of the critical minerals involved, which will last us for many decades at current rates of extraction. So these companies that are saying, we've got to go to the deep sea to mine to support the green transition are being disingenuous and self-serving. This is not true at all. We don't need to go there. And because we don't need to go there, it would be absolutely stupid to start mining and extracting from areas that are such sensitive ecosystems. I mean, these are very cold, completely dark places, occupied by highly sensitive marine life. But like shallow seas, there are also very significant deposits of carbon stored in those deep sea sediments. Until now, that has been secure, but the mining industry will churn up a huge amount of it, which will then be on the move for many, many years and will travel thousands of kilometers underwater. And there's no way that we can get into the deep sea and remediate the damage. And even if we were to protect an area of deep sea bed fully after the cessation of mining activities, it's not going to recover on any meaningful timescale to us. We've seen from studies that have gone back to areas where there was experimental mining disturbance applied 30 years plus ago, and those have seen no recovery at all. These habitats are essentially altered permanently on our timescales. They're not coming back, and particularly if you remove all these manganese nodules, that is in itself a part of the habitat, and what would come back in the absence of those nodules would be very different from what was there in the first place. So don't go there. It's far too important part of the planet in terms of the processes that make the planet livable, for us to risk disrupting all of that and causing a global catastrophe.
And still with the high seas, there's the complicating factor that the things that need protection don't always stay in the same place. We had an article in the Marine Biologist magazine recently about the Costa Rica thermal dome, which is a persistent feature of high productivity that, as we know now, moves around. And then there are highly migratory species like whale sharks. What do we do about those?
It is a complicating factor, and it's one that is a challenge for conservation. But it's not an unfamiliar challenge. So, of course, we have lots of protected areas to support birds, and many of those birds are seasonal migrants. So it works for birds. It can work for fish too, and for whale sharks. And so we need to have a complementary set of protected areas alongside other protections in the intervening spaces that will offer some level of good management and protection to wildlife that is moving between places. We've also seen that the dire predictions that the fishing industry made that protecting areas like the Northwest Hawaiian Islands from all fishing would collapse the tuna industry. No, it hasn't. In fact, we know from the results of that tuna fisheries are gaining from the protection of even these mobile species. They're moving in and out of the protected area. The protected area is building up populations, and some of that is spilling over into the fishing grounds and propping up catch per unit of fishing effort. So there are positive impacts even for highly migratory species. I remember when the Chagos protected area was being proposed in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and the fishing industry said, well, we shouldn't protect this area because it won't work anyway. The fish will simply move through it and come out the other side. I remember a very well-known conservationist at the time, now sadly deceased, Bill Ballantyne. He said, well, you can just wait till they come out the other side then, And it turns out, of course, that the Chagos Marine Protected Area has been protecting tuna stocks, is generating benefits to the surrounding fisheries, and in contradiction of the point that the industry was trying to make. Can't have it both ways, though. You can't say, oh, this protected area won't work, so there's no point protecting it, and then complain when you establish the protected area.
And how can we talk about marine protected areas without the debate becoming polarized?
The debate will always be polarized, I think. Everybody argues things from their own angle. I think there are grounds, there are common grounds. Obviously the common ground between protected areas and the fishing industry is that both rely on healthy populations of marine life and intact and productive habitats. And so, we share common goals across those who want to exploit and those who want to protect. I think what has been very difficult is getting meaningful engagement across conservation and extractive use because of suspicions on both sides. And I think it's difficult for us not to talk about these things in a polarized way. The fishing industry has done immense damage, not intentionally, but through its activities, to the marine environment over the course of centuries in many places. And so we are at a point where we need to understand that damage, we need to repair it. That is going to get in the way of some people's industrial activities. They are going to need to change the way they do things. We need to change the way we fish at sea in any case, because it's not going to be resilient to changes that are happening in the marine environment. So we need to be fishing in a much more precautionary way anyway, because the environment is rapidly shifting under climate change. That means fishing less. That means using less destructive methods. It means using more selective methods, and it means protecting a lot more space in the ocean. And by putting together that package, we're going to have productive, healthy, biodiverse nature and productive, economically valuable fisheries that will supply us long into the future.
Thank you. That's great. I've got a couple of questions I ask everyone. What 3 things should we know about you?
What 3 things? That's a good question. I am deeply interested in protecting ocean life and restoring oceans to health. I am very concerned that we reinvigorate the sea around areas that we've traditionally thought of as being just places to extract from. And so I'm very proud to lead the Convex Seascape Survey, which is trying to give a makeover to soft sediment, open ocean habitats that have been neglected by conservation for a long time. Those areas, as I said earlier in the interview, store a great deal of carbon. They're very important to us, and yet they're neglected. Everyone thinks that they're resilient and robust to anything that we do to them, that they'll recover very quickly, and that what we're doing to them doesn't matter very much. And none of those things are true. They are sensitive and important environments. They deserve careful management and protection. And the third thing is that I love coral reefs, and those are very different places, but equally threatened by things that are very much harder to control than fishing. Climate change is the main driver of coral reef decline, but we are making vigorous efforts to find ways to give a better future for coral reefs.
And what advice would you give to a young person who wants to become a marine biologist?
This is an exciting career. There are lots of opportunities. Protecting our world and improving it for the future is something which will give you a lifetime of pleasure as well as a great deal of strife. It's well worth pursuing as a career.
Great. Thanks, Callum. Well, it's been a real pleasure speaking to you. Thank you very much for giving us your time, and we'll hope to keep up with your research in the future.
It's a great pleasure from my side too. Thank you.
Enjoyed this podcast? Why not become a member of the Marine Biological Association and become part of a global community advocating for the ocean? You'll receive 4 beautiful copies of our magazine annually, The Marine Biologist, as well as receive a host of other benefits. Simply join us at www.mba.ac.uk.